chair now recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, for 5 minutes.
Ms. Kinsinger, you may be aware, I hope you are, that an unknown pathogen that has killed at least 85 horses at the Bureau of Land Management's Canyon City Wild Horse and Burro facility in Colorado since Saturday, April 23. The infected horses are initially identified with respiratory difficulties, and then they suffer neurological effects. The Bureau of Land Management has reported that federal and private veterinarians are working to determine the cause, but they haven't figured it out yet. The facility currently holds 2,500 horses. Now it's down to approximately 2,400. So 3.5% of the horses in that confinement have died in the last week. Bob Baffert has not been seen around those horses. These horses are kept in close quarters. If they were not penned, it is entirely possible that the pathogen would have not spread nearly as quickly. Are these types of outbreaks that our USGS ecosystem program typically studies?
We do study disease outbreaks, and I am aware of this outbreak in wild horses, although that is not something that we have been involved in. I did put out a request to our National Wildlife Health Center to see if they'd been involved, and they have not to date. But we have a very close working relationship with the Bureau of Land Management. We've done other non-disease related work on wild horses, and so I'd be happy to keep the committee apprised of any additional information.
If you would, the disease and the death is certainly disturbing, and that's the subject of this hearing, but I'm concerned about the horses and the burros in general. So if you'd let us keep us informed on that, I'd appreciate it. These, we know they could affect other than just the horses, we don't know. And the Bureau of Land Management has certainly not been very effective in this process. The ranchers like to use that land out there, which they pay ridiculously low fees for, $1 per cow, which hasn't been changed a month, which hasn't been changed that fee for a couple of decades. And the cows are about twice as large now, so they eat a lot more, but it should be more like $20 based on 20 years and the size of the cows. But we subsidize it. You know, sometimes you've heard the expression, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Well, when the Bureau of Land Management's involved with cattle ranchers, it seems like there is such a thing as a free lunch. And then they move the horses away because they say the horses are eating the raw materials there, and the horses get pinned up and taken, and sometimes they end up being shipped off to Mexico. However, people buy them, but they're not supposed to. But the horses, the burros are at risk. The programs they've had, we'd be looking into having a hearing on this to see that this is done in a humane fashion and that the burros and the horses are looked upon they should have rights in those lands to graze. They are an American treasure. Do you have any other information or knowledge of the BLM and their horse burro policy?
I can't speak to their specific policies, but as I said, USGS has worked with BLM on a couple things. One is in helping to improve their monitoring protocols so that we understand how many horses are out there in the wild, and then looking at reproductive capacities, reproductive techniques for slowing the reproduction of horses.
Well, thank you very much. On behalf of Trigger and all the other horses, past and present, I appreciate your looking into that, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Ms. Kinsinger, appreciate you being here, and I noted you made a passing reference in your testimony to mink farming and to some surveillance work that USGS is doing. I think we're going to try to get our heads around this subject of wildlife-borne diseases in the context of this current pandemic. We need to talk about mink a little bit more. I am told that, even though there are some anecdotes about cats and big cats getting COVID, mink are really the species where we know it has gone back and forth between humans and actually mutated within mink populations and then come back to us. Meanwhile, we produce millions of minks in mink farms in the United States for export, I'm told, mainly to China. So I wonder if you could tell us a little more about the level of concern we should have about these mink farms as a vector for the spreading of COVID and potentially, creating a mutation laboratory almost here in the United States simply so that we can sell furs to China.
So yes, I do think it's a serious concern, as it is with other animals, both domesticated and wild, that not only are affected by COVID-2, but also can serve as reservoirs for potential transmission back to humans and also to other wildlife. The USGS role in the mink farm surveillance really did focus on wildlife surrounding the mink farms, and we did test a large number of animals. I think the number was 365, and it did show quite a lot of presence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus in those animals.
So what are you doing about that? We're continuing to raise and export these minks, as I understand it, back and forth to China, of all places, in the middle of this pandemic. Isn't this something that we should be sounding the alarm about, looking into, taking action?
Well, I think, as I say, the USGS role really is in looking at the wild animals. We work closely with those who do make those sorts of management and policy decisions, but I wouldn't want to speak for them.
So you are purely looking at the wildlife in the area around the mink farms. Do I understand that correctly?
Yes, and that response is being led by USDA, and so our information has been given to USGA to help in their very difficult management decisions.
And I think in your words, you said you were finding quite a bit of COVID just in that surrounding wildlife tracking that you're doing. Is it fair to assume that the level of COVID within the mink farm itself, where these animals are confined and presumably don't even have a lot of interaction with the surrounding environment, wouldn't it be fair to assume that we might have an even bigger problem within the mink farms?
Well, it is definitely true that animals that congregate do have higher levels of transmission.
Now, is this I'm a little surprised, frankly, that we're not hearing more from you about that, but maybe that's just a function of USGS and jurisdictional lines that constrain you. So, maybe there are other witnesses that can speak to this, but are there other authorities or resources that you would want to do more about what seems like a pretty clear and present danger posed by these mink farms?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, in the 23 budget, we do have some ample funding to look at wildlife diseases in the wild. We did receive some specific increases in our 22 omnibus bill as well, but there's always room to expand our capacity. And as I said, these are decisions that are informed by the science of USGS, but there are a lot of factors that go into making those decisions.
All right. Well, I appreciate your testimony, and I understand the limitations that you're under there. But my understanding is that of all the animals that we might concern ourselves with, mink should be perhaps at the top of the list in terms of the known transmission of this virus back and forth between minks and humans, and the known mutations that have already arisen from that, and the volume of mink farming and the trade back between the United States and China. I mean, these are all huge red flags. So, Madam Chairman, thanks so much. I yield back.